All right, today we're diving into one of the most devastating economic calamities in modern history, the Great Depression. And this wasn't just some blip on a stock chart, it was a decade-long crisis that completely reshaped the fabric of American society. Just take a second and look at this. This isn't just a picture, it's a gut punch. For one family, 4 potatoes were their entire Christmas dinner. This is the human cost we're talking about. A level of hardship and, honestly, despair that's just so hard to wrap our heads around today. But here's the wild part. Just before all this, America was living it up in the roaring 20s, a time of incredible wealth, wild parties, and endless optimism. So what on earth went so terribly wrong? How did we get from there to here?
To really get the collapse, you have to first understand the boom. And it turns out the prosperity of the 1920s, well, it was kind of an illusion. It was all built on a foundation that was incredibly shaky.
You know, the warning signs were definitely there. As early as 1927, the economy was sputtering, showing clear signs of a recession. But the government and business leaders, they pretty much just ignored them. To keep the party going, the Federal Reserve made credit super easy to get, which just poured gasoline on the fire of stock market speculation. And the banks, they got swept up in it too, making all sorts of risky loans and investments with their customers' money. And a huge part of this bubble was something called buying on the margin. So imagine this. You could buy $1,000 worth of stock with only $100 of your own cash. The rest, it's a loan. Now, as long as that stock price keeps going up, you feel like a genius. But what happens if it goes down? Well, you get wiped out. And by 1929, the market was absolutely flooded with people playing this incredibly dangerous game. And that, of course, brings us to the crash itself. This wasn't just a bad day on Wall Street. Oh no, this was the trigger that set off a catastrophic chain reaction that ripped through the entire economy. And it all happened with terrifying speed. On October 24th, Black Thursday, the market takes a massive hit, and panic starts to set in. But the real knockout punch, that came 5 days later on Black Tuesday. Panicked investors were just trying to sell everything they had at any price. And the market, it just vanished. Fortunes that took a decade to build were gone in a matter of hours. But the crash didn't just stay on Wall Street. It kicked off this vicious downward spiral across the whole country. The banks, seeing their own investments get wiped out, slammed the brakes on lending. And without loans, factories couldn't operate, so they laid off workers. Of course, those unemployed workers couldn't buy anything, so demand for goods just collapsed, causing even more businesses to fail. It was a perfect, devastating economic storm. So let's move away from the abstract numbers of the market crash and get into the brutal, everyday reality for millions of Americans. Because this wasn't just an economic crisis. It was a human catastrophe. For ordinary people, one of the first dominoes to fall was the banks. I mean, just look at this chart. In 1929, 659 banks failed. By 1933, that number had exploded to over 5,000. Can you imagine? People who had trusted the banks with their entire life savings went to get their money, only to find the doors locked and every penny gone, forever. And with businesses and banks collapsing, the jobs just vanished. By 1932, a staggering 25% of the American workforce was unemployed. Just think about that for a second. 1 out of every 4 people who wanted a job simply could not find one. With no job and no savings, families lost their homes. They ended up in these makeshift shantytowns, built from scrap metal, old crates, whatever they could find. And in a sign of just how angry people were, they mockingly named them Hoovervilles, a direct jab at President Herbert Hoover. The desperation was just everywhere. Men would ride freight trains across the country, hoping to find any work at all. But cities, already overwhelmed, would put up signs like this one: "Jobless men, keep going. We can't take care of our own." There was simply nowhere to turn. And as if things weren't nearly bad enough, nature delivered another crushing blow. Years of poor farming techniques combined with a brutal drought turned the Great Plains into a massive desert, what we now call the Dust Bowl. Giant dust storms buried farms and homes, forcing hundreds of thousands of families to just abandon their land and head west, becoming refugees in their own country. So, with the country in an absolute freefall, all eyes turned to the government in Washington, D.C. for help. But the response from President Hoover's administration, well, it would go down as what many saw as a catastrophic failure. To really get why Hoover did what he did, or more accurately, what he didn't do, you have to understand his core philosophy. He was a huge believer in rugged individualism. He truly felt that the government's job was to just get out of the way and let private businesses and charities handle the crisis. Direct government aid, he feared, would just weaken the American spirit.
That whole philosophy just collided head-on with reality in the summer of 1932. 22,000 desperate World War I veterans, who people called the Bonus Army, marched on Washington. They were just asking the government to pay them a promised bonus a few years early. Hoover didn't just refuse to meet them. He actually ordered the U.S. Army to drive them out of the city.
And this was the shocking result. You're seeing the U.S. Army, under its own president's orders, burning the veterans' camp to the ground. And look there in the background. You see the Capitol Dome, the very symbol of American democracy. For millions of Americans, this image sealed Hoover's fate. It was just undeniable proof that the government was completely out of touch with the suffering on the ground.
So, you see, the Great Depression was so much more than an economic event. It was a fundamental turning point. It forever, and I mean forever, changed the relationship between the American people and their government.
The total inability of the old approach to solve the crisis just blew the doors wide open for something new. That whole philosophy of rugged individualism and limited government had been put to the ultimate test, and, in the eyes of millions, it had failed spectacularly. And that right there, that is the great legacy of the Depression. It absolutely shattered the old way of thinking. For the first time in American history, people, en masse, began to believe that the federal government had a direct responsibility to provide a safety net, to actually get involved and manage the economy to protect their well-being. This shift in thinking is what led to the New Deal, and honestly, it continues to shape our political debates to this very day. And that leaves us with a pretty big question for today, doesn't it? Nearly a century later, where do we stand on this? If another crisis of this magnitude were to hit, would we still, as a society, turn to the government for a massive intervention? Or, in our current political climate, has that spirit of rugged individualism started to make a comeback? It's definitely something to think about.